Did the Falcons get it wrong when they hired Raheem Morris?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And you may know me as your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Also may know me as Mr. Drew, as the iron that sharpens the iron, as Mr. AKA. And I've been covering this Atlanta Falcons team for a very long time, almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are going to be talking about whether or not Raheem Morris was the wrong hire. We'll be reviewing the 2024 draft class, and I got to give a special shout out to the Locked On Falcons Insiders for suggesting some of these topics. I went into today being like, I don't know specifically what I'm going to talk about. And, you know, they gave me a lot of great feedback. And so now I have no excuse. I'm basically probably booked up for the next couple of months in terms of topics I can discuss. So appreciate the Locked On Falcons Insiders. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider, hit that link in the description below. But, you know, let's start off talking about Raheem Morris and whether or not he was the wrong hire. Do I think Raheem Morris was the wrong hire? Not really. Now, there's going to be a lot of comments on this video saying why Raheem was the wrong hire. And it's easy, I think, to look at the results and sort of know that we didn't get the results that we wanted. I don't think it's as black and white as maybe some people will paint it, but, you know, I welcome all of you guys to leave those comments because, you know, the more comments you leave, the more it helps me in the YouTube algorithm. So I'm just going to be like, you know, what do you mean by that? Elaborate further, you know, please add another comment. But, you know, I think partly why I have that nuanced opinion is I have a different worldview on sort of why things happen. Right. And I think a lot of people believe in sort of outcomes are kind of fated. It's kind of this idea of a domino effect is you knock down that first domino and then whatever the multiple dominoes that fall between now and the end of that outcome is kind of fated to happen. And I tend to think it's like it's piecemeal, right? It's like you knock down one domino and then you got to knock down another and then you got to knock down another. It's a step-by-step process. And if you change any steps on the ways between that first decision, you know, in this case, hiring Raheem Morris and the outcome, Falcons missing the playoffs, that there was a lot of steps between there that where things went wrong for the Atlanta Falcons. And so, you know, I think where Raheem and company went wrong was basically Raheem took the approach last offseason of like, hey, Terry's already built up a playoff team and it's really on us as coaches to get the most out of it, right? And it's like we're gonna change, we're gonna upgrade the quarterback position, we'll tweak some other things, but 75 to 80%, we're already built it all the way up, right? And that number comes from, you know, how much of the 2023 roster the Falcons retained going into 2024. And I feel like that's where Raheem went wrong. Either he had too much faith in the job that Terry Fontenot had done in the 3 previous years, or he had too much faith in himself to make up whatever that difference was to get the team over the hump. And it's part of the reason why I tend to give Zach Robinson a harder time because, you know, I said last offseason, it was less a bet on Kirk Cousins being the savior of the franchise, and it was more a bet on Zach Robinson being the savior of the franchise by taking basically all the same pieces plus Kirk Cousins and gluing it all together, you know, all the pieces that Arthur Smith had and being able to maximize that group, which they would need in order to make the playoffs. And, you know, for that reason, I think a lot of people think I tend to be a little too hard on Zach Robinson, given that he was a first-time offensive coordinator. And, you know, it's the notion of like, hey, you know, it's unrealistic to expect the first-time offensive coordinator to be good. And I'm just like, I don't think that's true, right? Arthur Smith, as a first-time coordinator, produced a top 10 offense. Same thing with Mike McDaniel and Bobby Slowick and Liam Cohen, right? All offensive coordinators that their first time calling plays in the NFL produced basically top 10 offenses out of the gates, right? You know, technically Bobby Slowick and the Houston Texans were like a top 14 offense, but they were top 10 passing offense. The run game was just so terrible that it prevented them from being a top 10 offense. And now you could argue maybe it was unrealistic for Zach Robinson to hit the ground running just because of the low odds, right? Like, let's say any given year you have 5 new play callers in the NFL and only one of them is capable, winds up producing a top 10 offense. So the odds are like only 20% of them hit, right? And so therefore it was only a 20% chance that Zach Robinson would produce a top 10 offense. But I think if you rewound the clock to last offseason, and you were placing bets on, which of the new guys, Zach Robinson, Alex Van Pelt, Brian Callahan, Liam Cohen, etc., would have produced a top 10 offense, I think Zach Robinson would have been the betting favorite. So I don't necessarily agree that my expectations were unrealistic for him going into year one, especially since a lot of the issues that Zach Robinson displayed as a first-time play caller were the same issues that we spent the previous 8 years complaining about from his predecessors, right? The sort of one-note run game of Arthur Smith, the not marrying your run game with the play-action passing game of Dirk Cutter, and struggling to perform at a high level against quality defense that we complained about consistently with Steve Sarkisian. And so from my perspective, it feels a little hypocritical to be critical of the predecessors and giving Zach Robinson a pass for those same things just because it's his first time. But I digress. Let's get back to the point of Raheem Morris. So, to me, using today's parlance, right, Raheem and company, they kind of lost the plot. They didn't quite understand the assignment, as the kids say. And I don't think this is due to one individual person, Zach Robinson, Raheem Morris, whatever, Terry Fontenot doing wrong. To me, this has kind of been the Falcons' MO since 2011. This has been a systemic issue for this organization, that they tend to be very complacent, right? The two exceptions in terms of offseason were 2016, 2023 in my eyes. Maybe there's another one that I'm forgetting about. But it's like every year, this team approaches every offseason like we're just one or two pieces away. And they did it again last offseason. So it's not nothing new. It's not unique to Raheem Morris. It's not unique to Terry Fontenot. That has been an issue going back, almost 15 years. But I don't think the future is predetermined, right? And even if I'm not particularly optimistic about it, I think Raheem and company do have the opportunity this offseason to begin riding the ship, right? Nothing is fated. Fate, to me, is what you make. And it's really not about Raheem or one individual deciding the fate of this football team, right? Football is a team sport. Your success is determined by a large group of individuals working together, 60 plus players, 20 plus coaches, 20 plus front office personnel, hundreds of people doing their jobs in order to determine your success. And I don't think, firing one or two people is going to suddenly make it all sort of click into place, which is, I think, the general convention, the general wisdom when it comes to this. Oh, once we get rid of Raheem, once we get rid of Terry, it's all going to work out. So the last point I'll say before we move on is, I feel like the Falcons' issues stem from they spent one offseason really investing 2023 and building up their roster. And in the NFL, I believe that it takes, 3, 4 or more off seasons to really of investing in order to build a winner. And either their mistake was thinking that they did 3 or 4 years worth of work in one offseason, or more likely that the 3 prior years that they had done good work to move the needle when they really didn't. And for me, at least, I don't think this team is going to get significantly better results than what we've seen over the last 7 years of them missing the playoffs until they start putting in the work of 3 or 4 years, right? And the hope is that by the time we get to the end of this offseason in May and June, I'll be able to say, hey, guys, we got 2 years. We just did it. We got our second year. They put in the work this offseason, upcoming offseason over the next couple of months to improve this roster. And then whatever the results are in 2025, we'll see. Hopefully they're better results than what we got last year. And if they are, that means the Falcons had their first winning record in 8 years, right? And then we'll have to come back in 2026. And then that will be the third year, right? And then maybe, just maybe, in 2027, right, we'll be able to finally say, now we're 1 or 2 pieces away, right? And so I've been asked so many times over the last, 5+ years, like, how long do you think, Aaron, until the Falcons are contenders? And most of the times when I've answered those questions, it's always been like 2, maybe 3 years. They're always 2 or 3 years because, it's really based on the sort of big if of whether or not they can solve their problems. And so hopefully we'll start to see this team solving problems this offseason instead of doing what they've done for the most part over the last several years. And again, this is not just a Terry Fontenot issue. It also applies to his predecessors of just constantly trying to put Band-Aids on solutions, right? I'm not particularly optimistic at this stage, but we'll see. So, I'll be here talking about it. So we'll see if this 2024 draft class can help solve some of these problems, right? By being greater contributions in 2025, starting with Michael Penix. And despite all the promise that Michael Penix showed in 3 games, I'm not quite ready to crown him. And it has little to do with Michael Penix and everything to do with the rest of the team around him. So as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, and which means when it's time to hire your partner, needs to work just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. And they're going to make it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. And when you post your job, LinkedIn has a new feature that's going to help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip: if you add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture, you will double the reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So let's review the Falcons 2024 draft class and talk about what our expectations are moving forward, in terms of talking about how they performed as rookies. It's like, you don't need my opinion on that. But let's focus on Michael Penix. Now, what I will say as far as Michael Penix's performances in 2024, he did outperform my expectations. My expectations were not particularly high on what he would do as a rookie. But I feel like, you have people on the opposite side of it where they've gone to the opposite extreme, where it's just like they're ready to crown Michael Penix, right? The Falcons nailed that pick. And I just say, let's pump the brakes. It's a little too early to tell. And again, I know a lot of you guys are going to be like, oh, you're only saying that, Aaron, because you hate the pick. You always have hated the pick or whatever. And it's like, no, guys, right? And I'm not a fan of relitigating picks, but for a moment, for the sake of argument, if we are going to relitigate the pick and use 2020 hindsight, when we talk about the opportunity cost, like if the Falcons had drafted Jared Verse instead, we'd probably be sitting here talking about, well, it's one less problem they got to solve in terms of the pass rush, right? Now, your counter is, well, if they had done that, we'd still be stuck with Kirk Cousins and we'd still need to solve the quarterback problem. And you're right in that sense. But my point is, it's still too early to tell if Michael Penix has solved that problem, right? We're a few years away from knowing if Michael Penix has solved the quarterback problem. Right? There's been, talking about Michael Penix and this potential to play for a decade here in Atlanta. I've heard that a bunch over the last 2 months. And it's like, what's interesting to me about that is like, there's only one quarterback that's been drafted in the last 15 years. It's been a decade with the team that drafted him. That was Cam Newton. Over the last 20 years, there's only 5. It's Cam Newton, Aaron Rodgers, Matt Ryan, Joe Flacco, Matt Stafford. Right now, if Patrick Mahomes plays 2 more years in Kansas City, he'll be the next one. Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen play 3 more years in Baltimore and Buffalo, respectively. They'll be added to that list. And I don't say that to be negative. I just say we're ways away. There's many years of good football between Michael Penix, today, and Michael Penix being that 10+ year, decade-long veteran quarterback, franchise quarterback, before we get there. And my skepticism over whether Penix is going to get there isn't really rooted in Michael Penix. Right. My only concern about Michael Penix is really that he's a similar type of quarterback as Kirk Cousins and Matt Ryan, where you can't just ask him to go out there and make plays. Right. You need to have a strong structure around him. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I tend to hold Zach Robinson to such a high standard. But my skepticism is mostly related to the Falcons, right, which includes my concerns about the play caller. Going back to, something you heard last year from me when Kirk was benched and Penix was promoted, that if you look at, the previous decade, a typical rookie in their first 3 or 4 starts wins about 30 to 40% of those games. And so Penix in his first 3 starts, if he's a typical rookie, he'll go 1-2. The Falcons went 1-2. Now, before you start, angrily replying and telling me, that wasn't Penix's fault and QB wins is not a QB stat, my point is, you're right. As good as Penix was in those 3 games, he couldn't beat his circumstances. And, it's why I'm not going to sit here and spend the next 6 months hyping up Penix, not because I'm a hater, right, guys? I want to pump Penix just like the rest of you, But to me, the rest of you guys are just going to start pumping away, because it feels so good. And I'm like, give me a reason. Give me some foreplay, baby, And to me, that foreplay is the Falcons building an environment around Michael Penix that's going to foster his development, right? It goes back to the nature versus nurture debate when it comes to quarterback development. And to me, most of the evidence I've observed over the last 2+ decades says that nurture is more meaningful than nature. But yet, when a player winds up being successful, we always just sort of assume, oh, he had the inherent nature to be successful, and that's why we got that outcome. Going back to what I'm talking about, where outcomes are faded, right? To me, Matt Ryan's a great example of we look at the nature of it rather than the nurture of it, right? I've mentioned before how we mythologize Matt Ryan's early career, mostly because most people don't really remember it, but because we know it was a good outcome. So we kind of ignore the ups and downs, or we only focus on the ups and not focus as much on the downs because we know how the outcome ended, right? We know we got a positive outcome. So, why are we talking about the negative things? But I've mentioned several times how in Matt Ryan's second start, he started that game 0 for 11 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He had nearly as many interceptions in the first half of that game, 2, as he had completions, 3. He had a 0 passer rating at halftime going into his first road start against a quality opponent. And I don't say all that stuff to take shots at Matt Ryan. It's just to illustrate that even for a successful quarterback like Matt Ryan, there were a lot more ups and downs early in his career. Ups and downs that happen with most young quarterbacks, nearly all young quarterbacks. Ups and downs that if the Desmond Ridder experience has taught us as anything, I don't think this fan base is ready to endure. As well as, a lot of that success that the Falcons had in 08 and 09, despite the Matt Ryan roller coaster, was mostly due to the team around him. Look at the run game, look at the defense. Now you're sitting there saying, how dare you, Aaron? Michael Penix is way better than Desmond Ridder. And yes, I think he is too. But that doesn't mean he's immune from riding the roller coaster. Matt Ryan was much better than Desmond Ridder. And my point is, he also rode the roller coaster. And if Penix isn't going to go through those ups and downs, it's less a reflection of him as an individual and more a reflection of the environment around him. And, I've said this before, where, you go back to that Thursday night game against the Ravens in 2010. That was the first time Matt Ryan threw the ball 40 plus times in a game, and the Falcons actually won the game. That was his 40th NFL start, if I'm not mistaken. Yet despite in the first 39 starts of his NFL career, the Falcons had won 67% of those, 2/3 of those games, right? For the most part, not because Matt Ryan had to put the cape on his back every single week, but because he was just asked to manage the game, because the Falcons, for the most part, could rely on their run game and, contrary to popular opinion, a halfway decent defense to win the majority of those games. And so the question to me is, will Penix be so lucky to be able to rely on a run game and a good defense to win a large percentage of his games over the next 3+ years? So I sit here and I go, like, again, I'm ready to pump that Penix, guys, but you got to get me in the mood first. And the way that you do that is tell me that Zach Robinson is going to be able to figure out how to use play action passing. Is our run game going to get there? Is our blocking going to be there? Who's he going to be throwing to? Is our defense going to stop anybody? And then I'll be right there alongside you, just staring you in the eyes, right? Just pumping away, just going at it. Just like, lock in, look at me. No, don't look away from me. Let's just keep pumping. So I'm ready to be there, guys, but we'll see how it all plays out. So Michael Penix wasn't the only draft pick the Falcons had in 2024. They had several others. So we'll talk about their expectations going into 2025 and why Ruke Orhorhoro is probably the one that you should get most excited for come this upcoming season. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, even if you missed the opening tip-off or you're just waiting for that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay, right? So, you want to talk about, Dyson Daniels and Trae Young, and you want to combine them all, right? If you're missing Boggy, you can go over and check that out at FanDuel, all the odds for what's individual stats, how many points the team is going to score in the first quarter, in the first half, all that and stuff. There's so many ways to bet. And all you got to do is head on over to FanDuel.com. And if you're a new customer, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So talking about the sort of 3 D linemen, 3 defensive players up front that the Falcons drafted immediately after taking Michael Penix, talking about Ruke Orhorhoro, Bralen Trice, and Brandon Dorlus. For me, of that trio that we're just kind of always going to kind of group together, my highest expectations going into 2025 is for Ruke Orhorhoro, assuming the Falcons stick with the 3-4 defense, which we'll see. But, typically in a 3-4 defense, you're going to have a 5 tech, a 1 tech, and a 3 tech as your 3 interior D linemen. And I expect Ruke to be the early down starter, at least at the 3 tech. Zach Harrison probably be the 5. I think they still got to go out there and get a 1, that nose tackle. Right now, I'm currently expecting, when we get to sub package, nickel, right? Ruke will get pulled off the field in those situations, and Grady Jarrett will sort of come in as that 3. At this stage, I'm expecting Arnold Ebiketie to be one of the edge rushers in that 4-man sub-package group. Who the other 2 guys in that 4-man sub-package group, I think, remain to be seen. My guess is the other edge is to be determined. I think we're going to add that this offseason. That second interior guy, that's where I think Brandon Dorlus could maybe make a name for himself, just given that he's probably a little bit more polished as a pass rusher than Ruke was. But Ruke is in that conversation. Zach Harrison could be in that conversation. It could be another offseason addition, a draft pick, a free agent. We'll see. Now, you're wondering, okay, where does Bralen Trice figure into this? I don't have as high expectations for Bralen Trice. I think he should be a part of the rotation, but I'm envisioning him more as sort of the 3rd or 4th guy in that edge rotation, basically playing a similar role to what we saw with James Smith-Williams or Lorenzo Carter this year. I think ideally he'll be the 4th guy, because I would love to see the Falcons add 2 edges this offseason, ideally 1 in free agency, 1 in the draft, and then along with Arnold Ebiketie and Bralen Trice, that's your sort of 4-man, quartet. Now, part of the reason why I don't have high expectations on Trice is due to the fact that he's coming off that ACL tear that caused him to miss his entire rookie season. Some players do come back from missing their rookie season due to injury and wind up living up to their, post-draft, pre-draft expectations. I'd wager, I haven't done the research, but I'd wager it's probably less than 20%. Now, maybe the argument could also be that like only less than 20% of all draft picks live up to the expectations. So the injury may not be as significant a factor as maybe I'm attributed to it being, but I do think losing that year of development in the first year, I think, is very crucial for the success and failure of NFL players. Probably isn't helping Bralen Trice. Now, the other reason is I just didn't have that high expectations for Bralen Trice. He would be more than a long-term backup here in Atlanta. Like, my eye level comp for him was Brooks Reed, and that eye level, for those unfamiliar, is to me a favorable outcome, but probably the likeliest favorable outcome rather than the player hitting their ceiling. Because in my experience, I forget the number. I talked about it a bunch over the summer, but I feel like it was only like 15% of Falcons draft picks hit their ceilings based off of my projections since 2018. So that's why I tend to not be as gung-ho on what Bralen Trice is going to do. But I think all of 3 of these guys are going to be bigger contributors in 2025 than they were in 2024. I guess it's TBD to sort of see how big those contributions are. Now, when you look at the other day 3 guys, JD Bertrand, I expect him to be a special teams player and a backup linebacker. My expectation, if going into the season, is if you're going to carry 4 off-ball linebackers this season, at Mike and Will, Caden Ellis is going to be one of those. Hopefully the Falcons will add a linebacker too, a starter at linebacker, and then Troy Anderson and JD Bertrand will be your primary backups, with Troy probably being the backup to Will, JD being the backup at the middle linebacker position. If JD has to do more than that, if he's more than the 4th linebacker on the depth chart, then I think something has gone completely wrong. And you're probably wondering, like, what about Nate Landman? Like, Nate Landman can be the 5th guy, but we'll see. Jace McClellan, the Falcons' current 4th string running back. And I think his status is really going to be tied to what happens with the Falcons' 2nd and 3rd string running back, which is currently Tyler Algier and Avery Williams. Avery Williams is a free agent. Tyler Algier is a player that we've mentioned as a potential, unlikely, but potential trade candidate. And if both are back, it's hard to see a significant path forward to Jace McClellan getting much action in 2025, significantly more action in 2025 than he got in 2024. Now, if the Falcons part ways with one of those guys, then that opens the door for Jace McClellan. I guess for me, the challenge is going to be, like, I don't know if Jace McClellan quite fills the shoes that you're looking for, like in terms of special teams value that Avery Williams brings to the table and sort of the offensive value that Tyler Algier brings to the table. So, we'll see what Jace McClellan does, but, maybe he splits the difference. Maybe he gives you some special teams value, some offensive value, and that basically makes him maybe not the best of both worlds, but, something good from both worlds. So we'll see on that front. Now, the last guy is Zion Logue is gone, is Casey Washington. And by the way, Zion Logue potentially would be the front runner to be that one technique nose tackle that we're talking about. But unfortunately, he's not. So the last guy we're talking about is Casey Washington. And I don't want to be a hater, although I'm sure I will sound like one too many of you. But the amount of Falcon fans I've seen suggesting Casey Washington as the potential replacement to Ray McCloud or upgrade to Ray McCloud over the last 2 months as the team's number 3 wide receiver is, for lack of a better term, insane to me. And the reason for that is because I don't think a lot of people that are hyping up Casey Washington actually watched him play in college. I think they're just basing it off of the buzz he created last summer from working with Michael Penix. And my spicy take is like, that has nothing to do with Casey Washington. It has everything to do with Michael Penix. And you could have probably put any receiver with him and you would have heard hype about them. And, the same applies to Casey Washington as it does to the Rondale Moore truthers that seem to think that Rondale Moore is going to be a massive upgrade at number 3 wide receiver. I watched 8 games with Casey Washington at Illinois, so I'm going to reiterate my opinion for those of you that missed it last summer. And I think that's 8 games more than 99% of this fan base. But he projects to me as a career backup, that if he can carve out an entrenched role on special teams, like say a gunner on the punt team, he might stick around long enough that he can develop as a decent backup receiver. But I don't see him being anything more than like a 4th or 5th wide receiver, right? Like the role that we saw Kadero Hodge have this year is probably, I'm not going to say his ceiling, because I thought his ceiling was Russell Gage, who was drafted to be a special teams player and turned into a halfway decent number 3 wide receiver in his time. But to me, the odds that he hits the Russell Gage level, if the odds of any given Falcons draft pick hit their ceiling is 15% or whatever it was, I don't feel like Casey Washington, the odds are significantly in his favor. Like I'll put it at 10% then, right? And like the reason why this triggers me is because like this is the same group of fans that in June of 2021 were like, we don't need Julio Jones because we have Frank Darby. And I'm just like, this is why I always come off as a hater, because it's like if I leave you guys to your own devices, you'll always say out of pocket stuff like that, And this is to Casey Washington or his family, if any of them are listening. I'm trying not to be a hater. If Casey, you come out and ball and play on special teams, I will absolutely be your biggest stand, because I'm one of 3 individuals on this planet that believes special teams matters. But it's funny to me because the area scout that scouted Casey Washington came out after the draft, and they basically said, we like how he projects on special teams. But yet, this fan base is like, he could be the number 3 wide receiver. And I'm just like, all right, guys, like whatever, man. So Casey Washington, 18 special teams tackles. Let's put it on the docket. But, 18 catches this year? No, I don't think so. But, I would love to be wrong. Casey Washington, you do what Darnell Mooney did, and prove me wrong. It'll be the 4th time it's happened in my lifetime. But, I'm so humble. Anyway, guys, so those are my thoughts on the 24 draft class. We should be back tomorrow with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, probably getting his thoughts on, potentially some lessons learned from the Super Bowl in terms of his thoughts. I'm sure, it'll give Jarvis a chance to rant about the Falcons not drafting Georgia players. So we got it. We got to pay the bills, right? I'm contractually obligated to give Jarvis his space every single year to complain about the Falcons not drafting Georgia players, even though my guy Trayshawn Diaz pointed out that Georgia is the school that the Falcons have drafted the most players from under Terry Fontenot. So that is sort of the irony of it all. But yeah, so we'll talk about that potentially on tomorrow's episode. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Thanks you to the Locked On Falcons Insiders for submitting some suggestions for topics today as well as in the future. And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider and get access to upcoming draft prospect breakdowns, previous draft prospect breakdowns, my previous extended all 22 content from the season, you can join at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. And of course, it's a 14-day free trial, so you can get that draft content between now and the combine for free. And if you like it, you can keep going for $4.99 a month. If you don't, then, hey, you get, 2 free draft videos in the next 14 days, and you can peace out. So, and, it also allows you to suggest topics for content of future episodes, as well as get my feedback on subjects that aren't necessarily worthy of the podcast. Not to say that they're not worthy, but, if you just want my immediate feedback rather than waiting a day or 2 for me to talk about on the podcast, you can do that. So that's at the link in the description below. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, the Locked On Podcast Network has So much great content ready for you. Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily to give you the lowdown on the biggest stories around the NFL. Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.